By 2002, the company Britain built to beat IBM no longer had a British name. Walk into its head office that spring, and the sign above the door reads Fujitsu Services. Not a merger, not a rebrand for marketing reasons. An absorption, decades in the making, that most of the public never noticed happening at all. To understand how the nation that built the first computer ended up renting its computer industry from Japan, we have to go back to a freezing morning in February 1951, in a city that had every reason to believe the future belonged to it. Manchester, 1948. Inside a university laboratory, a machine known as the Baby runs the world's first stored program, a piece of software held in electronic memory rather than fed in by hand. It works. It is a small, unglamorous proof of a very large idea, and it puts Manchester 3 years ahead of anywhere else on Earth. 3 years later, that idea becomes a product. In February 1951, Ferranti delivers the Mark I to Manchester University, a machine built directly from the Baby's design, sold commercially before anyone else in the world has managed it. 1 month later, America's UNIVAC ships its first unit. Britain got there first, on record, by a clear and documented month. It isn't a one-off. In 1951, a tea shop chain called J. Lyons, famous for its high street cafes, not electronics, builds its own computer to run payroll and inventory. They call it Leo, the Lyons Electronic Office. When it goes live in 1954, it becomes the world's first computer used to run a business, not a university, not a government lab, a catering company, doing something no one else on the planet has done yet. By the early 1960s, Britain pushes further still. Ferranti's Atlas, developed with Manchester University, becomes briefly the most powerful computer in the world. And it introduces something still fundamental to every device you own today. Virtual memory, the trick that lets a machine work with more data than it can physically hold at once. This isn't a country playing catch-up. This is the country setting the pace. What made this possible wasn't one company. It was several, all racing at once. Ferranti in Manchester. Leo Computers, born out of a cake shop's back office. English Electric, absorbing Marconi's computing arm. Elliott Brothers, building machines for the Admiralty and for industry. Each with its own engineers, its own customers, its own stubborn belief that it could out-design the others. That rivalry produced real technical leadership. British firms weren't imitating American designs. They were originating ideas Americans hadn't reached yet. Universities and industries sat close together, feeding each other talent and problems to solve. For a brief window in the late 1950s and early 1960s, if you wanted to see where computing was going, you looked at Britain the way people once looked at Manchester for electricity. But underneath the achievement sat a structural weakness nobody had solved. Britain didn't have one computer industry. It had 5 or 6 small ones, each too small on its own to match the scale IBM was building in the United States. IBM could spread its research costs across a market the size of a continent. Britain's computer makers were splitting a market the size of one country between themselves, and competing just as hard against each other as against IBM. By the mid-1960s, the government has noticed the same problem. Tony Benn, as Minister of Technology in Harold Wilson's Labour government, reaches a conclusion that sounds entirely reasonable on paper. If the problem is too many small British firms fighting for scraps, the answer is one large British firm big enough to fight IBM directly. In 1968, under the Industrial Expansion Act, the government forces the pace. English Electric's computer arm, Elliott's, and International Computers and Tabulators are pushed together into a single entity. International Computers Limited, ICL. The press calls it a national flagship. The government calls it the answer to American dominance. Here is the quiet problem nobody wants to say out loud at the signing ceremony. A flagship assembled by government decree isn't the same as a company built by competition and survival. ICL doesn't inherit one clean product line. It inherits several incompatible ones, several overlapping engineering teams, and a management structure built to satisfy a ministry rather than a market. Its single largest customer base isn't global business. It's the British public sector, the post office, the inland revenue, government departments that buy because they're told to, not because ICL has outcompeted anyone for the business. The company that was meant to give Britain the scale to compete with IBM was, from its very first year, a company built primarily to sell to itself. For a while, it holds. Through the 1970s, ICL grows at roughly 20% a year, riding demand from the public bodies that depend on it. But growth built on a captive customer base is not the same as competitiveness, and by 1981, the gap is exposed. ICL posts an £18.7 million loss. IBM's newer, cheaper machines are eating into the market ICL assumed was safe. A hostile bid from America's UNIVAC appears on the table. Margaret Thatcher's government, philosophically opposed to propping up industry, is reluctant to step in at all. It does anyway, in the only way it's willing to. Loan guarantees, not investment, and a new man brought in to run the company. Rob Wilmot, poached from Texas Instruments, just 36 years old. Wilmot makes the single decision that will define everything that follows. Rather than continue funding ICL's own in-house chip development, expensive, slow, uncertain, he cancels it and signs an agreement giving ICL access to the semiconductor technology of a Japanese company most of ICL's own customers have never heard of, Fujitsu. At the time, it's presented as a technology license, arm's length, nothing that touches ICL's identity as a British company. Nobody in that meeting frames it as the moment control begins to leave the country, because it isn't, yet. It's a supplier relationship. It just happens to be the only supplier relationship ICL cannot function without. If you're finding this pattern of well-reasoned decisions leading somewhere nobody intended as unsettling as I do, stay with me, because the ending doesn't need a fraudster. It only needs time. Through the 1980s, that relationship deepens. In 1984, Standard Telephones and Cables buys ICL outright. Then, in 1990, Fujitsu buys 80% of ICL from STC for roughly £1 billion. No longer a technology license, but outright ownership of most of the company. By 1998, Fujitsu is ICL's sole shareholder. There is no dramatic collapse, no shareholder panic, no morning where trading gets suspended. Just a name that quietly stops appearing on its own letterhead. In April 2002, ICL is formally rebranded Fujitsu Services. The flagship built to keep a computer industry British ends its life as a subsidiary of the country its creation was meant to compete with. There was no single villain in this story. No fraudulent contracts, no forged documents, no man sentenced in a Philadelphia courtroom. What ended Britain's computer industry was a longer, quieter kind of failure. A sequence of individually defensible decisions that, stacked together across 3 decades, added up to losing the thing entirely. A government that solved fragmentation by force rather than growth. A flagship built to serve a ministry before it served a market. A leadership team, decades later, that made the rational short-term call to buy foreign chip technology rather than keep funding a British alternative. Because in the moment, it was cheaper, faster, and nobody could see where it led. What Britain lost wasn't just a company. It was the deep, specific expertise that had put Manchester 3 years ahead of the world in 1948. The engineers who understood how to build these machines from first principles, not license someone else's. Once that knowledge stops being renewed inside British walls, it doesn't come back by writing a check. It has to be built again, from nothing, by someone willing to wait the way Sebastian de Ferrante's generation once did. Britain invented the computer. Twice, arguably. Once in a university lab, once in a tea shop's back office. It just never worked out how to keep owning what it built. And somewhere in that gap between inventing something and holding on to it sits the real story of how a country can lead the world and still end up reading its own history on a machine that answers to somebody else. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe. There's more of Britain's industrial history where this came from,